We have our next speaker, Miss Julie T. Underhill, who is a good friend and a Cham researcher who's here to talk about the art of Champa architecture. Please give her a warm round of applause.
Hi, welcome. Thank you so much. I'm gonna be off the stage so that I can see what I'm presenting and be able to talk to you a little bit. Thank you for being here and for the invitation. So I'm going to speak a little bit today about Cham art and architecture, different cultural aspects of the Cham community, and a little bit of history. So the historiography of Champa, the way that we've learned about Champa, has been through Cham, Chinese, Vietnamese, and French sources, both looking at the physical remains like the temples, the art, the sculpture, but also the inscriptions in Cham and Sanskrit that show up at the temple complexes. So this is how we know what's happened in the past, looking at these particular things. So here's an illustration by a French anthropologist who was an art historian, and a lot of what we do know of the history of our temples came really partly through the work that French scholars did during Indochina in order to try to preserve what was left of the Cham temples and art. So this map here shows you the mandala of Southeast Asia. O.W. Walters proposed that, that power was sort of held in these mandala arrangements. And so you see here that Champa is connected at the same time as Angkor and other kingdoms had power, right? And our cultural influences really first came after our Austronesian indigenous spirituality and origins. Our cultural influence next came from India, right? Which is why we're a Hinduized people before we received others. So our art and architecture is still largely connected to that history and really closely tied with Indian influence. Here are trade routes from Southeast Asia, from India, that shows you how we were connected in a larger sphere of influence that India had. At the time of our Indian influence, we were considered part of further India. And that's part of how we became Indianized. Here's a sample of Cham script. These are some of the, these are some of the steles at the temple sites that allow us to interpret the religion of the past. Our language, our written language is Sanskrit based, which was derived also from India. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the temples, and really focusing on Mesan, the one that's most well known and was mentioned earlier in our early morning as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So an overview of the temple sites. This map shows all the places in red. It's hard to see back there, but all the temple sites that are attributed to Champa are on this map in red. So you see that our ancestors left a lot of sacred architecture for us, right? These are sites of worship, and to this day, festival and pilgrimage sites for some people. So we had the first temple sites in Southeast Asia. Our Hindu influence was from the Pallava part of India, and their temples are very similar to the ones that our ancestors built. There was some Buddhist influence around the 9th and the 10th century, and there's some artwork that I've included that has that Buddhist influence as well. And there's some indigenous elements. Our connection to a mother goddess comes from an indigenous belief system, and you see that showing up in the art and the architecture. We deified kings. If a king did good deeds, we we gave them an honorific and we turned them into like a form of someone we would worship by putting the word Po on there, right? We have a mother goddess that's honored in a Chang at the temple there. And we still hold contemporary ceremonies, including the Kate festival at different temple sites. And now our temples have been converted into sites of tourism, which can be a point of conflict between the Cham people's need to continue to worship and outsiders who want to visit for whatever reason they have. My Son is in the central part of Vietnam. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it was the intellectual and religious center of the Cham Kingdom for over 1,000 years, probably. It's the longest continuously occupied temple complex in Southeast Asia, even longer than Angkor Wat, which is a bit more famous. And it's about 60 kilometers from Da Nang. It's a burial place for the kings, and it was also the place where our libraries were held. There's over 70 buildings, but unfortunately during the American War, some of those buildings were bombed by the Air Force and we lost them. So if you visit My Son, you'll see craters from where some of the temples have been destroyed. Here's a few more pictures of My Son. It was dedicated to Shiva, one of the Hindu gods that our ancestors honored. There are tall niche-style houses with sculptural figures incorporated into it, and it has very distinct lines of these temples. Here's another picture of My Son, which is a sanctuary, considered a sanctuary. And this is a floor plan or a map of the site, including some of the buildings that have since been destroyed. This is an illustration from 1930 of what My Son, the place Simrapura, which is the capital, what My Son was supposed to have looked like at the time. So this is a French illustrator trying to capture what it was like back in the day. Po Nagar is in the Chang. It's right in the middle of the city, so it's kind of rare because a lot of our temples are in places that aren't close to commerce. So it's very interesting to visit because it's right in the middle of the city. And this is also a pilgrimage site still for the Cham people, honoring at ceremony, right? And then Po Klang Garai is in what is old Panduranga, now Phan Rang. And this is one of the best preserved temple sites in Vietnam for multiple reasons. The buildings are still largely intact. So it's quite beautiful. And the Kate festival happens here and at other temples during October. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the artwork, and there's so much artwork that I'm barely scratching the surface, but just giving you a bit of overview. Cham art is largely religious in nature, having that Hindu influence that I mentioned earlier. There's a range of distinctive styles, so they're often categorized that way as being part of My Son or Chakyu or wherever the temple was. The styles changed of the architecture or the art depending on where it was situated and what time. So a lot of our artwork was actually built into the temples, and they've been removed and put into museums or private collections. So originally this art was part of worship and part of honoring, you know, the gods. So what we consider Cham art shows up in altars, statues of gods and goddesses, and the stele, which is where the Sanskrit, our Sanskrit-based writing has has left evidence of the past. This is photos from some of the excavations of some of the Cham art that got brought into the Cham Museum in Da Nang, which was set up by the French in the early 20th century. And so here's just a few different pieces that show the different styles of Cham art. This is a Brahmin from Misan. This is Shiva dancing in the Tapmam style of the 12th century. This is Maya, mother of Buddha, from the Yongyung style of 9th to the 10th century. So this is the time that the Buddhists had influence on our art, and so there's more Buddhist-centered art during that time period. And incidentally, the 9th century is the height of our kingdom. It's when we had the most numbers as a people, and the population estimate was about 2.5 million in the 9th century. So we talk about genocide, we talk about the loss from 2.5 million in the 9th century to about 165,000 today. That's quite a population loss between those centuries. Here's the head of Shiva from that same site, 9th, 10th century. You know, we also did metal work. A lot of the art we think of is carved in stone, but we also have things that have been cast in metal, right? Here's Ganesh from Misan. I actually took this picture, and I took it partly because someone laid a Cham flower at the base, and I thought it was a very fitting tribute, you know, to our kingdom as well, and a little offering, right? And here's a linga and its middle ring. The linga is symbolic of the phallus, and the middle ring has breasts around it, and so this also shows the influence of Hinduism, which incorporated lingas and shivas and breasts into the iconography. But we're the only Indianized kingdom that use breasts as part of our prayer altars. And I theorize it's from having a connection to the mother goddess, thinking of the breasts as a form of life, right? You pray for what you want. So I'm basically showing this here, that there are no other counterparts in Southeast Asian countries or Indianized kingdom that use the breast this way in sacred art, which I think is fascinating. And the closest you get from here to seeing Cham art is at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. They have these pieces on display in San Francisco, so if you ever end up at that art museum, you can see Cham art while you're there. And just a few last things. I don't want to leave out our dancers and the fact that we just saw clothing that's also connected to dance this morning when our elders danced for us with a fan dance. So here are photos of Cham dancers at the Kate Festival in 1965, right? So this is the same year the US put ground troops in Vietnam. You know, even during war, we did our very best to keep our traditions intact. And the Kate Festival also is a really great opportunity for dancers and musicians to come and celebrate together. And it's a very lively, beautiful, exciting time. It lasts 3 days, and it includes offerings to gods and ancestors with traditional attire, music, and songs. So just a little tiny bit about the music, which we've been hearing today. There are some traditional instruments and traditions that are intact. I'm probably going to say the name of the instruments wrong, but the ginang drum, the baranang drum, the saranai, clarinet, and gongs and bells. And interestingly enough, during our conquest by the Vietnamese, Cham musicians, singers, and dancers were captured, and they were forced to teach their music and methods to the Vietnamese. And those who research music in Vietnam know that the Cham instruments affected Vietnamese music. So that is one way that our cultural influence was incorporated by the Vietnamese, is through the music that we were forced to teach the Vietnamese after they began conquering us. And just a few pieces. I very rarely see Cham jewelry put into books, but I have a book that has pictures of Cham jewelry from the 10th to the 12th century. It's quite beautiful, and you can see the traces of it in some contemporary jewelry practices as well. So thank you very much for listening.
Julie. I know it must have taken you a lot of time to prepare that presentation. Thank you so much, Julie. So we're gonna welcome back to the stage Mr. Sang Lu Jr. Not only is he an MC, but he has multiple roles, including being the Sacramento representative that's gonna talk about active involvement on indigenous issues. Please give him a round of applause.